He froze at his reflection in the mirror, because the man in the glass wasn't smiling back.
Part 28 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 28. Father Sheeby, James Buxton, and James Farrell, otherwise called Buck Farrell, executed for murder. About the year 1766, Ireland was first visited by an atrocious gang calling themselves White Boys, who committed numerous atrocities in armed bodies, but whose deeds of blood at this time were only a prelude to those scenes of horror which have continued to be enacted even up to the present day. They were encouraged, it was reported, by a number of disaffected Roman Catholic priests, who seduced various misguided men of property of their persuasion to connive at and assist them in their nefarious practices. In the present instance, Father Sheeby, a Romish priest, persuaded Mr. Buxton, a gentleman of great property, and Mr. Farrell, a gay thoughtless youth of good family, and many others, to murder several Protestants who opposed the depredations of the White Boys. On the 28th of October 1764, this gang of murderers met on the lands of Shanhally, where they were sworn by Father Sheeby to murder J. Bridge, Esquire, J. Bagnall, Esquire, the Reverend Dr. Hewitson, and, in fine, every person who might oppose them. He also swore them to be true to the French king, and to assist him to conquer Ireland, whereby they might completely establish the Roman Catholic religion. Thus prepared, these enthusiasts sallied out in pursuit of the blood of their fellow creatures. They soon seized Mr. Bridge, accused him of giving information against the White Boys, and insisted that he should contradict upon oath all that he had said in his information, and on his refusing to do so, Edward Meacham, one of the gang, whom however we do not find brought to punishment, cleft his skull in two with a bill-hook, and he instantly expired in the presence of the remainder of the gang. The persons whose names are mentioned above, having been apprehended on suspicion of being concerned in this cruel murder, were tried at Clonmel, and being found guilty, were executed in 1766. William Guest, executed for diminishing the coin of the realm. Guest was the son of a clergyman of unblemished character of the city of Worcester, who placed him apprentice to a genteel business. He passed the term of apprenticeship to the satisfaction of his master, and then came to London and took a shop at Holborn, where he carried on business some years with the usual success of trade. His father's good name assisted him in procuring a clerkship in the Bank of England, and there he pursued a system of fraud which procured his execution for a crime amounting to high treason, that of diminishing the gold coin of the realm. He took a house in Broad Street Buildings, in a room in the upper part of which he used to work. Having procured a curious machine for milling guineas, not unlike that made use of by mathematical instrument makers, he used to take guineas from his drawer at the bank, file them and return them to the bank, and take out guineas of full weight in their stead. Of the filings he made ingots, which he sold to an assayer, who, on his trial, deposed that they were of the same standard as our guineas. About 3 years before his conviction he became a teller at the bank, and Mr. Leach, who was also a teller there, observing him picking out new guineas from the old ones, and having some suspicion, watched him to discover whether this was a frequent practice, and finding that it was, he communicated his suspicions to some others. On the 4th of July 1766, Mr. Guest paid 30 guineas to Richard Still, a servant to Mr. Corner, a dyer at Bankside, Southwark, and Leach, observing him take some gold out of a bag in the drawer and put it among the rest of the table, went after Still and asked him if his money was right, and begged he would walk with him into the pay office and let him tell it over. The man consented, and Leach found 3 guineas that appeared to have been newly filed, which he took away, giving Still other guineas for them. He then carried the light guineas into the hall and showed them to Mr. Robert Bell, another teller, who carried them to Mr. Race, the principal cashier. The latter weighed them and found that they wanted from 10 pence to about 14 pence of weight each, and he then, having examined the edges, delivered them to Leach. It is a custom at the bank for the cashier in waiting to take the teller's bags every night and lock them up, and Mr. Race, after these suspicious circumstances had appeared against the guest, ordered his bags to be examined after they were taken away. This was done by Mr. Thompson, one of the under-cashiers, and Kemp and Lucas, 2 indoor tellers, who found the whole sum they contained to be £1,800, 16 shillings and sixpence, and they found in one bag 40 guineas, which appeared to have been filed on the edges, and each of which was found to be deficient in weight, from 8p to 14p. In consequence of this discourse, Mr. Sualis and Mr. Humberton, servants to the bank, went with the proper officers to search Mr. Guest's house in Broad Street Buildings, and in a room up 2 pairs of stairs they found a mahogany nest of drawers, which, being broken open, was discovered to contain a vice, files, an instrument proper for milling the edges of guineas, 2 bags of gold filings, and 100 guineas. The nest of drawers had a flap before to let down, and a skin was found lying at the bottom, fastened to the back part of the flap, with a hole in the front part, to fasten to a button on the waistcoat, in the manner used by jewellers. Mr. Guest was then apprehended, and being brought to trial was found guilty, and sentenced to be executed. He subsequently zealously applied himself to the only duty which remained for him in this life to perform, that of making his peace with God, and was hanged on the 14th of October, 1767. Elizabeth Brownrigg, executed for murder. The case of this most notorious criminal is too well remembered to render any introduction to it necessary. The long scene of torture, in which the inhuman wretch kept the innocent object of her remorseless cruelty ere she completed the long premeditated murder, requires no comment, engaging as it did the interest and exciting the horror of all ranks of people, and rousing the indignation of the populace more than the case of any criminal whose offences it is our duty to record in the whole course of our melancholy narratives. The wretched subject of this memoir passed the early part of her life in the service of many respectable families in London, but at length, being addressed by James Brownrigg, a plumber at Greenwich, she consented to marry him, and they were accordingly united in that town. After having resided at Greenwich during about 7 years, they determined to remove to London, and they in consequence rented a house in Fleur de Lis Court, Fleet Street, where Brownrigg carried on his trade with so much success that he was enabled to hire a small house at Islington as a summer retreat. Their means, however, declining as their family increased to the number of 16, Mrs. Brownrigg applied to the overseers of the parish of St. Dunstan to be employed in the capacity of midwife to the workhouse, and testimonials having been produced of her ability, for she had already practised midwifery to a considerable extent, she was duly appointed. Her services were found to give entire satisfaction to the parish officers, and she now hit upon a new mode of adding to her income. She, in the year 1765, opened a house in which she advertised her readiness to receive women to lie in privately, but finding that the expense of keeping servants would be very great, she applied to the officers of the precinct of Whitefriars and of the Foundling Hospital for Girls to be apprenticed to her, to learn the duties of household servants. 2 girls, named Mary Mitchell and Mary Jones, were immediately placed with her, the former from Whitefriars, and the latter from the Foundling Hospital, and it would appear that at first the poor orphans were treated with some degree of consideration and attention, but as soon as they became familiar with their mistress and their situation, the slightest inattention was sufficient to call down upon them the most severe chastisement. The first girl who experienced this brutal treatment was Jones, and it appears that her mistress would frequently, upon the smallest possible provocation, lay her down across 2 chairs in the kitchen, and there whip her until she was compelled, from mere weariness, to desist. The usual termination of this scene of disgusting inhumanity was that the mistress would throw water over her victim, or dip her head into a bucket of water, and then dismiss her to her own apartment. The room appointed for the girl to sleep in adjoined the passage leading to the street door, and after she had suffered this maltreatment for a considerable time, as she had received many wounds on her head, shoulders, and various parts of her body, she determined not to bear such usage any longer, if she could secure her liberty. Observing that the key was left in the street door when the family went to bed, therefore she opened it cautiously one morning, and escaped into the street. Thus freed from her horrid confinement, she repeatedly inquired her way to the Foundling Hospital, until she found it, and was admitted after describing in what manner she had been treated, and showing the bruises she had received. The child having been examined by a surgeon, who found her wounds to be of a most alarming nature, the governors of the hospital ordered Mr. Plumtree, their solicitor, to write to James Brownrigg, threatening a prosecution if he did not give a proper reason for the severities exercised towards the child, but no notice of this having been taken, the governors of the hospital, thinking it imprudent to indict at common law, the girl was discharged, in consequence of an application to the Chamberlain of London. The other girl, Mary Mitchell, continued with her mistress for the space of a year, during which she was treated with equal cruelty, and she also at length resolved to quit her service. An opportunity soon presented itself which favoured her design, but having escaped from the house, she was met in the street by the younger son of Brownrigg, who forced her to return home, where her sufferings were greatly aggravated on account of her elopement. In the interim, Mrs. Brownrigg found it necessary to fill up the place occupied by her late apprentice, Mary Jones, and she applied again to the overseers of the precinct of Whitefriars, who, having learned nothing of the ill behaviour of the woman, bound a girl named Mary Clifford to her, who was doomed to fall a victim to her brutality, and to be the cause of her eventual execution. It was not long before the new apprentice experienced equal, if not greater, cruelties than those inflicted upon the other unfortunate girls. She was frequently tied up naked and beaten with a hearth-broom, a horsewhip, or a cane, till she was absolutely speechless, and the poor girl having a natural infirmity, her mistress would not permit her to lie in a bed, but placed her on a mat in a coal-hole that was remarkably cold. After some time, however, a sack and a quantity of straw formed her bed instead of the mat, but during her confinement in this wretched situation she had nothing to subsist on but bread and water, and her covering during the night consisted only of her own clothes, so that she sometimes lay almost perished with cold. On a particular occasion, when she was almost starving with hunger, she broke open a cupboard in search of food, but found it empty, and on another day, being parched with thirst, she tore down some boards in order to procure a draught of water. These acts of what were deemed daring atrocity by her inhuman mistress immediately pointed her out as a proper mark for the most rigorous treatment, and having been stripped to the skin, she was kept naked during the whole day, and repeatedly beaten with the butt end of a whip. In the course of this barbarous conduct, Mrs. Brownrigg fastened a jack-chain around her neck so tight as almost to strangle her, and confined her by its means to the yard door, in order to prevent her escape, in case of her mistress's strength reviving, so as to enable her to renew the severities which she was inflicting on her. And a day having passed in the exercise of these most atrocious cruelties, the miserable girl was remanded to her cellar, her hands being tied behind her, and the chain being still round her neck, to be ready for a renewal of the cruelties on the following day. Determined then upon pursuing the wretched girl still further, Mrs. Brownrigg tied her hands together with a cord, and fixing a rope to her wrists, she drew her up to a water-pipe which ran across the kitchen ceiling, and commenced a most unmerciful castigation, but the pipe giving way in the midst of it, she caused her husband to fix a hook in the beam, and then again hoisting up her miserable victim, she horsewhipped her until she was weary, the blood flowing at nearly every stroke. Nor was Mrs. Brownrigg the only tormentor of this wretched being, for her elder son having one day ordered her to put up a half-tester bedstead, her strength was so far gone that she was unable to obey him, on which he whipped her until she sunk insensible under the lash. At length the unhappy girl, being unable any longer to bear these unheard-of cruelties, complained to a French lady who lodged at the house, and entreated her interference to procure some remission of the frightful barbarities which had been practised upon her. The good-natured foreigner appealed to Mrs. Brownrigg, showing to her the inhumanity of her behaviour, but the only effect produced was a volley of abuse levelled at the person who interposed, and an attempt on the part of the monster to cut out the tongue of her apprentice with a pair of scissors, in the course of which she wounded her in 2 places. The close of this prolonged tragedy, however, now approached, when the disgusting barbarity of Mrs. Brownrigg, at which the heart recoils and sickens, was to be discovered and punished. In the month of July, the stepmother of Clifford, who had been living out of town, came to London for the purpose of inquiring after her daughter, and learning from the parish officers that she was in the service of Mrs. Brownrigg, she immediately proceeded to her house, and requested to be allowed to see her. She was, however, refused admittance by Mr. Brownrigg, who even threatened to carry her before the Lord Mayor if she came there to make further disturbances, and upon this she was going away, when Mrs. Deacon, the wife of Mr. Deacon, baker, at the adjoining house, called her in, and informed her that she and her family had often heard moanings and groans issue from Brownrigg's house, and that she suspected the apprentices were treated with unwarrantable severity. The suspicions of the neighbourhood being thus raised, every means was employed to procure the unravelment of the truth, and the proceedings of the guilty parties themselves obtained the discovery of all their wickedness. At this juncture Mr. Brownrigg, going to Hampstead on business, bought a hog which he sent home, and the animal being put into a covered yard, having a skylight, it was thought necessary to remove the window in order to give it air. As soon as it was known that the skylight was removed, Mr. Deacon ordered his servants to watch, in order, if possible, to discover the girls. Accordingly, one of the maids, looking from the window, saw one of them stooping down. She immediately called her mistress, who procured the attendance of some of the neighbours, and having all of them been witness to the shocking scene which presented itself, some men got upon the leads and dropped bits of dirt in order to induce the girl to speak to them, but she seemed wholly incapable. Mrs. Deacon then sent to Clifford's mother-in-law, who immediately called upon Mr. Grundy, one of the overseers of St. Dunstan's, and represented the case. Mr. Grundy and the rest of the overseers, with the women, went and demanded the sight of Mary Clifford, but Brownrigg, who had nicknamed her Nan, told them that he knew no such person, but if they wanted to see Mary, meaning Mary Mitchell, they might, and she accordingly produced her. Upon this Mr. Deacon's servant declared that Mary Mitchell was not the girl they wanted, and Mr. Grundy now sent for a constable to search the house. An examination took place, but the girl being concealed, she was not found, and the officers, notwithstanding the threats of Brownrigg, took Mitchell away. On their arriving at the workhouse, she was found to be in a most wretched state. Her body was covered with ulcerated sores, and on her taking off her leathern bodice, it stuck so fast to her wounds that she shrieked with the pain, but on being treated with great humanity, and told that she would not be sent back to Brownrigg's, she gave an account of the cruelties which she had undergone, which she described even more terrible than we have ventured to paint them. She also stated that she had met her fellow apprentice on the stairs immediately before the parish officers entered the house, and added that Mrs. Brownrigg had concealed her, so that she should not be found. Upon this Mr. Grundy and the others went back to Brownrigg's, and in spite of his threats of prosecution, proceeded to take him into custody. He then promised to produce the girl if he were allowed his liberty, and this being consented to, she was brought out of a cupboard under a beaufet in the dining-room. Words cannot adequately describe the condition of misery in which the unfortunate girl was found to be on her being examined. Medical assistance was immediately obtained, and she was pronounced to be in considerable danger, and Brownrigg was in consequence taken into custody and conveyed to Wood Street, Compter. His wife and son, alarmed at this proceeding, absconded, carrying with them some articles of value for their support, and Brownrigg subsequently, being carried before Mr. Alderman Crosby, was fully committed for trial, upon the charge of having been guilty of violent assaults. The melancholy death of the girl Clifford, however, which took place in St. Bartholomew's Hospital a few days afterwards, altered the complexion of the offence, and a coroner's inquest having been summoned, a verdict of wilful murder was returned against the three Brownriggs, father, mother, and son. The two latter in the meantime had shifted about from place to place in London, and had taken every means in their power to disguise themselves, but at length they removed to Wandsworth, determined to await there the result of the trial of their relation. It so happened, however, that they took lodging in the house of a Mr. Dunbar, a chandler, and that person, having some suspicion of his guests, watched them narrowly, and seeing an advertisement which described their persons exactly, as being participators in the murder which had been committed, he caused their apprehension. At the ensuing session at the Old Bailey, the three prisoners were brought to trial, and, after an investigation of 11 hours' duration, Mrs. Brownrigg was capitally convicted, but her husband and son were found not guilty of the offence imputed to them. Mrs. Brownrigg was immediately sentenced to undergo the extreme penalty of the law, while the participators in her guilt were detained for trial on the minor charge of misdemeanour, of which they were eventually convicted, and were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. After sentence had been pronounced, the unfortunate woman addressed herself to the Almighty, and being attended by the ordinary of the jail, she confessed to him the enormity of her guilt, and that the punishment which awaited her was a just one. The parting between her and her husband and son is described to have been one which exhibited the strongest affection to exist, and which appeared to call up all those better feelings of the heart in the breast of this wretched woman, which must have lain dormant during the whole course of the maltreatment to which she subjected her wretched apprentices. On her way to the scaffold she was assailed by the mob, who expressed the most unmitigated disgust for her crime, and before the termination of her existence she appeared to be fully sensible of the awful situation in which she stood, and prayed the ordinary to acquaint the people that she confessed her crime, and acknowledged the justice of the sentence. After her execution, which took place at Tyburn, September the 14th, 1767, her body was put into a hackney coach and conveyed to Surgeons' Hall, where it was dissected and her skeleton hung up. End of Part 28. Part 29 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 29. John Williamson, executed for murder. The case of this criminal is a fit companion for that of the wretched being whose fate we last described. Williamson was the son of people in but indifferent circumstances, who put him apprentice to a shoemaker. When he came to be a journeyman, he pursued his business with industry, and in a short time he married an honest and sober woman, by whom he had 3 children. His wife dying, he continued some time a widower, maintaining himself and his children in a decent manner. At length he contracted an acquaintance with a young woman, deficient in point of intellect, to whom he made proposals of marriage, in the anticipation of receiving a small sum of money which her relations had left her for her maintenance. The woman was nothing loath, and notwithstanding the opposition of her guardians, Williamson having procured a licence, the marriage was solemnized, and he in consequence received the money which he expected. Within 3 weeks after the marriage his ill-treatment of his unhappy wife commenced, and having frequently beaten her in the most barbarous manner, he at length fastened the miserable creature's hands behind her with handcuffs, and by means of a rope passed through a staple in the ceiling of a closet where she was confined, drew them so tight above her head that only the tips of her toes touched the ground. On one side of the closet was now and then put a small piece of bread and butter, so that she could just touch it with her mouth, and she was daily allowed a small portion of water. She once remained a whole month without being released from this miserable condition, but during that time she occasionally received assistance from a female lodger in the house, and a little girl, Williamson's daughter by his former wife. The girl having once released the poor sufferer, the inhuman villain beat her with great severity, but when the father was abroad, the child frequently gave the unhappy woman a stool to stand upon, by which means her pain was in some degree abated. On the Sunday preceding the day on which she died, Williamson released his wife, and at dinner time cut her some meat, of which, however, she ate only a very small quantity. Her hands being greatly swelled through the coldness of the weather and the pain occasioned by the handcuffs, she begged to be permitted to go near the fire, and the daughter joining in her request, Williamson complied. But when she had sat a few minutes, her husband, observing her throwing the vermin that swarmed upon her clothes into the fire, ordered her to return to her kennel. She immediately went back to the closet, the door of which was locked till the next day, and she was then found to be in a delirious state, in which she continued till the time of her death, which happened about 2 o'clock on the Tuesday morning. The coroner's jury being summoned to sit on the body, Mr. Barton, a surgeon of Red Cross Street, who had opened it, declared that he was of the opinion that the deceased had perished through the want of the common necessaries of life, and other evidence being adduced to criminate Williamson, he was committed to Newgate. At the ensuing sessions at the Old Bailey, he was brought to trial before Lord Chief Baron Parker, and the principal witnesses against him were his daughter, Mrs. Cole, and Mr. Barton, the surgeon who opened the body of the deceased. The prisoner's defence was exceedingly frivolous. He said his wife had provoked him by treading upon a kitten and killing it, and then turning up the whites of her eyes. He had the effrontery also to declare to the court that he had not abridged his wife of any of the necessaries of life, and after sentence of death was pronounced he reflected upon his daughter as being the cause of his destruction. Being put into the cells, he sent for a clergyman, and acknowledged that he had treated his wife in the cruel manner represented upon the trial, adding, however, that he had no design of depriving her of life, and he afterwards behaved in a decent and penitent manner. He was conveyed to the place of execution in a cart, attended by 2 clergymen and a Methodist preacher. The gallows was placed on the rising ground opposite Chiswell Street in Moorfields, and after he had sung a psalm and prayed some time with an appearance of great devotion, he was turned off, January 19th, 1767, amidst an amazing concourse of people. His body was conveyed to Surgeons' Hall for dissection, and his children were placed in Cripplegate Workhouse. Sarah Metyard and Sarah Morgan Metyard, executed for the murders of parish apprentices. A single year had not elapsed since the public example made of Elizabeth Brownrigg, to which public indignation was yet alive, when these 2, if possible more cruel women, were found guilty of torturing their apprentices to death. Sarah Metyard was a milliner, and her daughter her assistant, in Bruton Street, Hanover Square, London. In the year 1758 the mother had 5 apprentice girls bound to her from different parish workhouses, among whom were Anne Naylor and her sister. Anne Naylor, being of a sickly constitution, was not able to do so much work as the other apprentices, and she therefore became the more immediate object of the fury of her mistress. The ill treatment which she experienced at length induced the unhappy girl to abscond, but being pursued, she was brought back and confined in an upper apartment, where her food consisted of a small piece of bread and a draught of water only each day. Seizing an opportunity, she again attempted to escape, but her young mistress was in time to see her run out, and following her and seizing her by the neck, she brought her back, and with great violence thrust her into an upper room. The old woman then interfered, and catching the girl, she threw her on the bed, while her daughter beat her unmercifully with a hearth-brush. This done, they put her in the back room, and fixing a cord round her waist, they tied her hands behind her, and fastened her to the handle of the door, so as to prevent her sitting or lying down. And in order that the example of her punishment might intimidate her fellow apprentices, they were ordered to work in the adjoining apartment, strict injunctions, however, being given to them to afford the prisoner no relief whatever. In this condition, without the smallest nourishment of any kind, the wretched girl remained for 3 days and 2 nights, when, having been let loose in order that she might go to bed, she crept up to the garret in a state of great exhaustion. On the 4th day she faltered in her speech, but was nevertheless again conveyed to what was worse than her condemned cell, and there, in the course of a very short time, she expired, her body being suspended by the cords which had again been placed round her person. The other girls, seeing that her whole weight was thus supported, cried out that she did not move, and the younger Metyard, coming up, said, "If she does not move soon, I'll make her," and immediately beat her on the head with the heel of a shoe. But finding that in truth she was senseless, she sent for her mother to come and assist her. The body was then released from its bonds, and efforts were made to restore animation, but without effect, and Mrs. Metyard, being convinced that the child was dead, removed her remains into the garret. On the return of the other children, who had been sent out of the way, they were informed that the girl had been in a fit, but was perfectly recovered, and it was added that she was now locked in the garret in order that she should not run away, and to strengthen the effect of this story, a plate of meat was sent up to the room where the body lay in the middle of the day for her dinner. On the fourth day a design was formed to follow up the tale which had been related, and the body of the deceased having been locked in a box, the garret door and the street door were left open, and one of the apprentices was desired to call Nanny down to dinner, and to tell her that, if she would promise to behave well in the future, she would no longer be confined. Upon the return of the child, she said Nanny was not above stairs, and after a great parade in searching every part of the house, the Metyards reflected upon her as being of an untractable disposition, and pretended that she had run away. The sister of the deceased, who was apprenticed to the same mistress, mentioned to a lodger in the house that she was persuaded her sister was dead, observing that it was not probable she had gone away, since her shoes, shift, and other parts of her apparel still remained in the garret. And the suspicions of this girl coming to the knowledge of the inhuman wretches, they, with a view of preventing discovery, cruelly murdered her and secreted the body. The body of Anne remained in the box 2 months, during which time the garret door was kept locked, lest the offensive smell should lead to a discovery, but the stench at length becoming very powerful, they judged it prudent to remove the remains of the unhappy victim of their barbarity, and therefore in the evening of the 25th of December they cut the body in pieces, and tied the head and trunk up in one cloth and the limbs in another, excepting one hand, a finger belonging to which had been amputated before death, which they resolved to burn. When the apprentices were gone to bed, the old woman put the hand into the fire, saying, "The fire tells no tales." But fearing that the consumption of the whole body would create an unpleasant smell, they determined to dispose of its parts by throwing them into the common sewer in Chick Lane. Being unable to effect this, however, they left them among the mud and water that was collected before the grate of the sewer, and some pieces of the body being discovered about 12 o'clock by the watchman, he mentioned the circumstance to the constable of the night. The constable applied to one of the overseers of the parish, by whose direction the parts of the body were collected and taken to the watch-house. On the following day the matter was communicated to Mr. Umfreville, the coroner, who examined the pieces found by the watchman, but supposing them to be parts of a corpse taken from a churchyard for the use of some surgeon, he declined summoning a jury. 4 years elapsed before the discovery of these horrid murders, but at length the dissensions which frequently occurred between their wretched perpetrators procured their apprehension and conviction. It appears that the mother was in the habit of treating her daughter with a brutality almost equal to that which she had exhibited to her apprentices, and about 2 years after the murders a gentleman of the name of Rooker took lodgings in the house of Metyard, where he lived about 3 months, during which time he had frequent opportunities of observing the severity which she suffered. He afterwards hired a house in Hill Street, and influenced by compassion for her sufferings, and being desirous of relieving her from the tyranny of her mother, he invited the girl to live in his family in the capacity of a servant, which offer she cheerfully embraced, though her mother had many times violently opposed her desire of going to service. The girl had no sooner removed to Mr. Rooker's house than the old woman became perfectly outrageous, and it was almost her daily practice to create disturbances in Mr. Rooker's neighbourhood by venting the most bitter execrations against the girl, and branding her with the most opprobrious epithets. Mr. Rooker subsequently removed to Ealing, to reside on a little estate bequeathed him by a relation, and having by this time seduced the girl, she accompanied him, and lived with him professedly in the character of his mistress. The old woman's visits were not less frequent at Ealing than they had been at Mr. Rooker's house in London, nor was her behaviour less outrageous. On the 9th of June 1768, being admitted to the house, she beat her daughter in a terrible manner, and during the contention many expressions were uttered by both parties that gave great uneasiness to Mr. Rooker. The mother called Mr. Rooker the old perfumed tea dog, and the girl resorted by saying, "Remember, mother, you are the perfumer. You are the Chick Lane ghost." The mother having retired, Mr. Rooker urged the girl to explain what was meant to be insinuated by the indirect accusations introduced by both parties in the course of the dispute, and bursting into tears, she confessed the particulars of the murders, begging that a secret so materially affecting her mother might never be divulged. Mr. Rooker imagined that the daughter could not be rendered amenable to the law, as she performed her share in the murders by the direction of her mother, and he wrote to the overseers of the parish of Tottenham, acquainting them with what he had learned. The elder Metyard was in consequence taken into custody, and the evidence against her being conclusive, she was fully committed for trial. Some circumstances, however, having come out which served to criminate her daughter, she was also secured, and with her mother was sent to Newgate to abide her trial. When arraigned upon the indictment preferred against them at the ensuing Old Bailey sessions, they bitterly reproached one another with the part each had taken in the affair, and if any evidence of their guilt had been wanting, their own declarations at this time would have been sufficient to secure their conviction. The jury immediately found them guilty, and they were sentenced to undergo the severest penalty of the law. The younger prisoner pleaded that she was pregnant on being called up to receive judgment, but a jury of matrons being assembled, they declared her plea false, and she was sentenced immediately. On the day fixed for their execution, the elder prisoner was found to be in a state of utter insensibility, and in that condition she was carried to the scaffold, and, all efforts to restore her having failed, was turned off. Her daughter prayed for a few minutes with the ordinary who attended her, but was in almost as melancholy a condition as her mother. They were executed at Tyburn on the 19th of July 1768, and their bodies were afterwards dissected at Surgeons' Hall. Frederick Lord Baltimore, Elizabeth Griffenburg, and Anne Harvey. Tried for the commission of a rape, the females as accessories before the fact. Although the trial of these persons was not followed by a conviction, the extraordinary nature of the transactions described by the prosecutrix in the case renders it our duty to state the facts alleged as they appeared at the trial. The title, which was inherited by Lord Baltimore, who was a peer of Ireland, was originally granted by James I to Mr. Calvert, from whom he was lineally descended, together with a large tract of land in America, now called Maryland. His lordship is related to have exhibited a taste for knowledge in early life, and was sent from Epsom, where he was born, to Eton, where he soon gained a considerable acquaintance with the classics. His father dying before he was of age, left him an ample fortune, and he is said to have shown at this time the existence of that passion which subsequently brought him into the difficulty from which he was compelled to extricate himself before a jury of his country. In obedience to the custom of the times, the young lord proceeded to perform the grand tour, and it is reported that having sailed from Naples to Constantinople, he there imbibed so great an admiration for the manners of the Turks, that on his return to England in 1766, he caused a portion of his family mansion to be taken down and to be rebuilt in the form of a harem. His lordship was not long in completing his new establishment, and, like the persons whose customs he imitated, he gave to its inmates certain rules, by which he directed that their conduct and demeanour should be regulated. The disgusting passions of his lordship, however, knew no bounds, and agents were employed in London, whose duty it was to select new objects for the gratification of his lustful desires. Amongst others who were thus engaged in this degrading office were the women Griffenburg, who was a native of Germany, and the wife of a Dr. Griffenburg, and Harvey, whose names appear at the head of this article. They were both women of low education, and their duty was to discover and point out persons who might be deemed worthy of the attentions of their employer, and in case of necessity to aid him in securing the end which he had in view. In the course of their brutal and inhuman searches in this occupation, they unfortunately discovered a young woman of considerable personal attractions, and of some respectability, named Woodcock, who kept a milliner's shop in Tower Hill, and Mrs. Harvey acquainting his lordship with her residence, in November 1767, he directly proceeded to the spot for the purpose of pursuing his diabolical designs. Calling at Miss Woodcock's shop, he purchased some articles of trifling value, with a view of making an acquaintance with her, and then, having succeeded in opening a conversation with her, he invited her to accompany him to the theatre. Miss Woodcock declined the offer, saying that her religious opinions taught her to believe that theatrical entertainments were incompatible with the due exercise of the worship of the Almighty, and his lordship, finding all his efforts to attain his object vain, retired, but only to put his agent, Mrs. Harvey, to work. Introducing herself as a customer, this infamous woman called repeatedly at the shop of her intended victim, and purchased ruffles and other articles of millinery. On the 14th of December, however, she proceeded to take active measures in her plot, and then ordering a pair of lace ruffles to be made by the following day, she directed Miss Woodcock to take them herself to her residence in the Curtain Road, Shoreditch, declaring that they were for a lady of rank and fortune, who was desirous of encouraging her in her business, and who, if the order was punctually obeyed, would without doubt become an excellent customer. The ruffles were finished and carried home at the appointed time, and then Miss Woodcock, being invited in, was received politely by Mrs. Harvey, who pressed her to stay for tea. She declined the invitation on the ground that it would be dark before she could reach home if she remained, but at this moment a man named Isaacs came in, who said he was going to the theatre, and Mrs. Harvey expressing a desire at once to convey the goods which had been brought to her to the lady for whom they were ordered, it was eventually agreed, after some objections on the part of Miss Woodcock as to her dress, that as Isaacs must hire a coach, they should all go together. At this time Lord Baltimore's carriage was waiting in the neighbourhood, and the Jew going out, called it up, and all three got into it, Miss Woodcock making no remark as to whether it was a private or hired conveyance. The coachman drove at a great pace, and after they had traversed many streets, the vehicle was driven into the courtyard of a house which appeared to be that of a person of consideration. Mrs. Harvey and Miss Woodcock then alighted, and being ushered into the house, they were conducted through several apartments until they reached one in which an elderly gentleman, afterwards known as Dr. Griffenberg, was seated, and he immediately retired, saying that he would acquaint the lady of the house with their arrival. Lord Baltimore soon afterwards entered, and Miss Woodcock was alarmed to find that he was the person who had visited her shop. He bid her rest quiet, however, saying that he was only the steward of the lady whom she was to see, and then quitted the room, but soon afterwards returned with Mrs. Griffenberg, who conversed with her as if she had expected her coming and was the lady of the house. Orders were afterwards given for tea, and on the equipage being removed from the table, Lord Baltimore presented some trinkets to Miss Woodcock, which he said he had purchased for her. As the evening advanced, she became anxious to return, and expressed her fears that her relatives would be surprised at her long absence, but his lordship, in order to divert her from this purpose, took her to view the apartments in the house, and at length, on her becoming still more importunate, insisted that she should stay for supper. Private orders having been given for the preparation of the meal, and Mrs. Griffenberg having retired, his lordship began taking liberties of an indecent character with the young lady, but on her exclaiming against this treatment, Mrs. Harvey and Dr. Griffenberg appeared, as if to aid in opposing her escape in the event of her attempting to obtain her liberty. Supper was soon afterwards served, but it does not appear that any idea was entertained by Miss Woodcock of an intention to detain her forcibly until after this meal, when Lord Baltimore told her that there were no coaches to be had then, and that she must remain for the night. Mrs. Griffenberg and Mrs. Harvey now endeavoured to prevail on the young lady to go to bed, but she declared that she would never sleep in that house, and although they conducted her to a room in which they went to rest, she continued walking about till the morning and lamenting her unhappy fate. Looking out of the window at about 8 o'clock, she observed a young woman passing, to whom she threw out her handkerchief, which was then heavy with tears, intending to attract her attention and send to her father for assistance, but the two women, jumping out of bed, prevented the possibility of her holding any communication with her, and upbraided her for what they called the rejection of her good fortune, declaring their wishes that they were in her happy situation. The women now quitting the room, Lord Baltimore and Dr. Griffenburg came in soon afterwards, when the former said that he was astonished at her outrageous behaviour, as he had promised that she should go home at 12 o'clock, but she replied that they had no right to detain her, and that she would go home directly, as her sister, and particularly her father, would be inexpressibly anxious on occasion of her absence. To this no answer was made, but Lord Baltimore conducted her downstairs and ordered breakfast. She refused, however, to eat, and having wept incessantly till 12 o'clock, at that hour she once more demanded her liberty. His lordship then said that he loved her to excess, that he could not part with her, but that he did not intend any injury to her, and would write to her father, and on this he wrote a letter, on which the following is a copy, and in it sent a bank note of £200. Your daughter Sally sends you the enclosed, and desires you will not be uneasy on her account, because everything will turn out well, with a little patience and prudence. She is at a friend's house, safe and well, in all honesty and honour. Nothing else is meant, you may depend on it, and, sir, as your presence and consent are necessary, we beg of you to come in a private manner to Mr. Richard Smith's, in Broad Street Buildings. Having addressed this to her father, he showed it to her, and desired that she would write a few words at the bottom, signifying her compliance with its terms, and terrified by her condition, she wrote, "Dear father, this is true, and should be glad you would come this afternoon. Your dutiful daughter." From the statement of the young lady, it appears that after this she conjured her lordship to give her her liberty, pointing out to him in the most striking manner the degradation to which she was subjected. But all her arguments were in vain, and she was again compelled to pass the night, as before, in the room with Mrs. Griffenburg and Mrs. Harvey. In the morning, by permission of his lordship, she wrote a letter to her father, desiring him to come to her immediate assistance, but saying that she had been treated with as much honour as she could expect. But still she declined holding any conversation with his lordship, and used all her efforts to make her situation known to the passers-by. In this, however, she was checked by his lordship and the women, who threatened to throw her out of the window in the event of her making any disturbance. Towards the middle of the day she was told that her father had called at Mr. Smith's, but had refused to wait until she was sent for. But at midnight Mr. Broughton, his lordship's steward, brought intelligence that Isaacs, the Jew, having offered a letter to Miss Woodcock's father, was stopped till he should give an account of where the young lady was secreted. Lord Baltimore was, or affected to be, in a violent passion, and vowed vengeance against the father, but in the interim the Jew entered and delivered a letter which he pretended to have received from Miss Woodcock's sister, and she took it to read, but she had wept so much that her eyes were sore, and of all she read she could only recollect this passage: "Only please to appoint a place where and when we may meet with you." The hour of retirement being now arrived, Miss Woodcock refused to go upstairs, unless she might be assured of not receiving any insult from his lordship. She had not taken any sustenance since she entered the house, and on this night she lay down in her clothes on a bed in which Mrs. Harvey reposed herself. She then asked this woman if she had ever been in love, and acknowledged that she herself was addressed by a young fellow who appeared very fond of her, and that they were to settle in business as soon as the marriage should take place, and she desired Mrs. Harvey to show her the way out of the house that had been so obnoxious to her, but the answer of the latter was, that though she had lived in the house several years, she did not herself know the way out of it. On the following morning, when Miss Woodcock went downstairs, she pleaded earnestly with Lord Baltimore for her liberty, on which he became most violently enraged, called her by the vilest names, and said that if she spoke to him on the subject any more, he would either throw her out of the window, or send her home in a wheelbarrow with her petticoats tied over her head. And turning to Isaacs the Jew, he said, "Take the slut to a mean house like herself," which greatly terrified her, as she presumed he meant a house of ill fame. The suffering she had undergone having by this time made her extremely ill, Lord Baltimore mixed a draught for her which he insisted on her drinking, and in the afternoon he compelled her to sit by his side to hear him converse upon the subjects of religion, in the course of which, however, he ridiculed everything sacred, and denied the existence of a soul. After supper he made 6 several attempts to ravish her within 2 hours, but she repulsed him in such a determined manner that he failed in accomplishing his dishonourable purpose. On that night she lay with Mrs. Harvey, but could get no rest, as she was in fear of renewed insults from his lordship. On the Monday morning she was told that she should see her father, and having been supplied with a change of linen by Mrs. Griffenburg, she was about midday hurried into a coach with Lord Baltimore, Dr. Griffenburg, and the 2 women, and with them conveyed to Epsom, where, as we have already said, his lordship had a country seat. Here she was told that resistance was useless, and that whatever objection she might make to submit to his lordship's desires, force would be used if her consent was not given. At supper she partook of some refreshment, and immediately afterwards she was conducted to a bedchamber, accompanied by the 2 women, who began to undress her. From weakness she was unable to make much resistance, and from the same cause she was prevented from opposing Lord Baltimore, who, it turned out, was in a bed which was in the apartment, and who, in spite of her cries and entreaties, twice effected his horrid purpose. In the morning Mrs. Harvey came to her, and she told her what had passed, but the only answer which was given was a desire that she should make no more fuss, for that she had made noise enough already. It would appear that after this the proceedings of his lordship were, to a certain extent, acquiesced in by Miss Woodcock, but it was not until several days had elapsed that she ascertained the name of the person who had dishonoured her. On the afternoon of which she made this discovery, the whole party returned to London, and Miss Woodcock was there introduced to Madame Saunier, the governess of his lordship's illegitimate children. On the next day his lordship gave her some money, and, when night advanced, directed that she should repair to his bed. Having been permitted on the night before to sleep by herself, she requested that the same favour might again be granted to her, but his lordship's commands being positive that she should share his couch, she consented on certain terms, which were fulfilled, while, according to her statement, a crime of a still more atrocious nature was committed. It may now be inquired whether no steps were taken by Miss Woodcock's friends in order to procure her discovery and the return to the roof of her parents, and it appears that some circumstances having been learned which induced them to guess the real place of her concealment, Davis, her lover, proceeded to Southampton Row, Bloomsbury, where his lordship's house was situated, and while watching there he saw her at the window. He immediately communicated the discovery which he had made to her father, and the advice of Mr. Watts, an attorney, having been taken, a writ of habeas corpus was obtained. These proceedings, however, were heard of by his lordship, and he conversed with Miss Woodcock on the subject, and, as she alleged, extorted from her a promise to declare that she had remained at his house voluntarily and of her own free will, promising to recompense her by settling upon her an annuity for life. She in consequence wrote a letter to her father to that effect, which was delivered by one of his lordship's servants, and on Mr. Watts proceeding to the house to serve the writ of habeas corpus, she made a declaration to him having the same tendency. Lord Baltimore then said that it was necessary that she should go before Lord Mansfield and make a similar statement, and she was accordingly conveyed to his lordship's house in Bloomsbury Square. They were there shown into different apartments, and Miss Woodcock's friends, having heard of the proceeding, were also in attendance in an antechamber, where they awaited the result of the conference. The young lady, on being examined by Lord Mansfield, expressed her willingness to remain with Lord Baltimore, but desired to see her friends first. She was then conducted to the room where her father was awaiting the conclusion of her examination, and there the first question which she asked was, "Who is Lord Mansfield?" Having been satisfied upon this head, and also that he had the power to set her at liberty, she desired to see him again, and then said she wished to go home with her father, and that she would no longer remain with Lord Baltimore. On Miss Woodcock's discharge, Mr. K, a baker in Whitecross Street, to whom her father had delivered the £200 banknote, which had been enclosed in the letter by Lord Baltimore, conveyed the young lady to Sir John Fielding, before whom she swore to the actual commission of the rape by his lordship. The two women, the coadjutors of his lordship, had been already taken into custody on the charge of decoying away the girl, and a warrant was now issued for the apprehension of Lord Baltimore. His lordship, however, secreted himself for the present, but surrendered himself to the Court of the King's Bench on the last day of Hilary Term 1768, when the two women being brought thither by habeas corpus, they were all admitted to bail, in order for a trial at Kingston in Surrey, because the crime was alleged to have been committed at his lordship's seat at Epsom. In the interim, Miss Woodcock went to the house of Mr. K in Whitecross Street, but not being properly accommodated there, she proceeded to the house of a friend, where she lived in great privacy and retirement till the time arrived for the trial of the offending parties. Bills of indictment being found against Lord Baltimore and the two women, they were all brought to the trial before Lord Chief Baron Smythe, and after the evidence against them had been given in substance as may be collected from the preceding narrative, Lord Baltimore made the following defence, which was read in court by Mr. Hammersley, solicitor to his lordship. My lords and gentlemen, I have put myself upon my country in hopes that prejudice and clamour will avail nothing in this place, where it is the privilege of the meanest of the king's subjects to be presumed innocent until his guilt has been made appear by legal evidence. I wish I could say that I had been treated abroad with the same candour. I have been loaded with obloquy, the most malignant libels have been circulated, and every other method which malice could devise has been taken to create general prejudice against me. I thank God that, under such circumstances, I have had firmness and resolution enough to meet my accusers face to face, and provoke an inquiry into my conduct. Hic murus aheneus esto, nil conscire sibi. The charge against me, and against these poor people who are involved with me because they might otherwise have been just witnesses of my innocence, is in its nature very easy to be made, and hard to be disproved. The accuser has the advantage of supporting it by a direct and positive oath. The defence can only be collected from circumstances. My defence is composed then of a variety of circumstances, all tending to show the falsity of this charge, the absurdity of it, the improbability that it could be true. It will be laid before the jury under the direction of my counsel, and I have the confidence of an innocent man that it will be manifest to your lordship, the jury, and the whole world, that the story told by this woman is a perversion of truth in every particular. What could induce her to make such a charge I can only suspect. Very soon after she came to my house, upon a representation to me that her father was distressed, I sent him a considerable sum of money. Whether the ease with which that money was obtained from me might suggest the idea as a means of obtaining a larger sum of money, or whether it was thought necessary to destroy me in order to establish the character of the girl to the world, I know not. But I do aver, upon the word of a man of honour, that there is no truth in anything which has been said or sworn of my having offered violence to this girl. I ever held such brutality in abhorrence. I am totally against all force, and for me to have forced this woman, considering my weak state of health and my strength, is not only a moral but a physical impossibility. She is, as to bodily strength, stronger than I am. Strange opinions upon subjects foreign to this charge have been falsely imputed to me, to inflame this accusation. Libertine as I am represented, I hold no such opinions. Much has been said against me, that I seduced this girl from her parents. Seduction is not the point of this charge, but I do assure your lordship and the jury, this part of the case has been aggravated exceedingly beyond the truth. If I have been in any degree to blame, I am sure I have sufficiently atoned for every indiscretion which a weak attachment to this unworthy woman may have led me into, by having suffered the disgrace of being exposed as a criminal at the bar in the county which my father had the honour to represent in Parliament, and where I had some pretensions to have attained the same honour, had that sort of an active life been my object. I will take up no more of your lordship's time than to add, that, If I had been conscious of the guilt now imputed to me, I would have kept myself and my fortune out of the reach of the laws of this country. I am a citizen of the world. I could have lived anywhere, but I love my own country, and submit to its laws. Resolving that my innocence should be justified by the laws, I now, by my own voluntary act, by surrendering myself to the Court of King's Bench, stake, upon the verdict of 12 men, my life, my fortune, and what is dearer to me, my honour. Baltimore, March 25th, 1768. The substance of the defence of Mrs. Griffenburg and Mrs. Harvey consisted principally in alleging that Miss Woodcock had consented to all that had passed, and that no force had been used towards her either by Lord Baltimore or themselves. The whole of the case having now been heard, Lord Chief Baron Smythe, in a clear and lucid manner, proceeded to sum up the case to the jury. Having pointed out to them the law of the case, as it affected the charge against the prisoners, and their defence, his lordship proceeded to recapitulate the evidence which had been produced, in doing which he was occupied during a period of 3 hours. He concluded by saying, "In point of law, the fact is fully proved on my lord and the 2 other prisoners, if you believe the evidence of Sarah Woodcock. It is a crime which in its nature can only be proved by the woman on whom it was committed, for she only can tell whether she consented or no. It is, as my lord observes, very easy to be made and hard to be disproved, and the defence can only be collected from circumstances. From these you must judge whether her evidence is or is not to be believed. Lord Hale, in his History of the Pleas of the Crown, lays down the rules. 1. If complaint is not made soon after the injury is supposed to be received. 2. If it is not followed by a recent prosecution, a strong presumption arises that the complaint is malicious. She has owned the injury was received December 22nd. The complaint was not made until December 29th, but she has accounted for it in the manner you have heard. The strong part of the case on behalf of the prisoners is her not complaining when she was at Lord Mansfield's, the supreme magistrate of the kingdom in criminal matters. You have heard how she has explained and accounted for her conduct in that particular, which you will judge of. Upon the whole, if you believe that she made the discovery as soon as she knew she had an opportunity of doing it, and that her account is true, you will find all the prisoners guilty. If you believe that she did not make the discovery as soon as she had an opportunity, and from thence or other circumstances are not satisfied her account is true, you will find them all not guilty. For if he is not guilty, they cannot be so, for they cannot be accessory to a crime which was never committed." After an absence of 1 hour and 20 minutes, the jury returned with a verdict that the prisoners were not guilty. This singular affair was tried at Kingston in Surrey on the 26th of March, 1768. It would be useless to offer any observations upon this extraordinary case. From the verdict returned by the jury, there ought to exist no doubt of the innocence of the persons charged of the offence imputed to them, but although Lord Baltimore and his companions were acquitted of the charge of rape, there can be little doubt that the ruin of the unfortunate girl Woodcock, even if what was admitted by his lordship were only true, was the effect of a vile conspiracy among the prisoners to sacrifice her to the libertine passions of his lordship. End of Part 29. Part 30 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 30. John Wilkes, Esquire, convicted of sedition and blasphemy. The year 1768 will ever be memorable in the annals of English history on account of the murders and mischief committed by a deluded mob, stimulated by the writings and opposition to the government of John Wilkes, Esquire, an alderman of London and member of Parliament for Aylesbury. The most scandalous and offensive of his writings were in a periodical publication called The North Briton, No. 45, and a pamphlet entitled An Essay on Woman. Footnote: The Essay on Woman was a parody on Pope's sublime work called An Essay on Man. A learned divine, the Reverend Mr. Kidgel, thus writes on the works of Wilkes. On the title page is an obscene print with a Greek inscription signifying the Saviour of the world. We shall, the poison of the publication being long eradicated, merely quote a commentator on the subject. In this work, An Essay on Woman, the lewdest thoughts are expressed in terms of the greatest obscenity, the most horrid impurity is minutely represented, the sex is vilified and insulted, and the whole is scurrilous, impudent, and impious, to an incredible degree. In the variations and notes, the inspired writings are perverted into the gross ideas of a libidinous blasphemer, with an invention new, wonderful, and horrid. The most solemn and important passages of the Gospel are tortured into the oblique obscenity of double meanings, worthy only of him who is at once the enemy of God and man. End of footnote. The North Briton was of a political nature, the other a piece of obscenity, the one calculated to set the people against the government, the other to corrupt their morals. Amongst the ministers who found themselves more personally attacked in the North Briton was Samuel Martin, Esquire, member for Camelford. This gentleman found his character as Secretary to the Treasury so vilified that he called the writer to the field. He had before been engaged in a duel with Lord Talbot, and had then escaped unhurt, but Mr. Martin shot him, and the wound proved so dangerous that he lay uncertain of recovering during several days, and was confined to his house for some weeks. His sufferings, however, did not end here, for the Attorney General filed informations against him as author of the North Briton No. 45, and the pamphlet entitled An Essay on Woman. Footnote: the paper entitled The North Briton was ordered to be burnt by the common executioner at the Royal Exchange. Mr. Alderman Harley, one of the sheriffs of London, attending in his official capacity to see this carried into execution, was assaulted and wounded by the mob. A man of the name of John Franklin was seized as one of the offenders and committed to Newgate. On the day of the conviction of Wilkes he was tried for this outrage at the Old Bailey and found guilty. When the trial was ended, the worthy alderman addressed the court in behalf of the prisoner. He said that, for his part, he had forgiven the affront offered to his own person, that justice required a prosecution. It had been, by the conviction of the offender, in part satisfied, and therefore he hoped the court would mitigate his punishment. The court complied with the prosecutor's humane request, and sentenced the prisoner to a short imprisonment, to pay a fine of 6 shillings and 8 pence, and to find security for his good behaviour for 1 year. End of footnote. On these charges he was apprehended, and his papers having been seized and inspected, he was committed prisoner to the Tower, but was soon admitted to bail. Before his trial came on, Mr. Wilkes fled to France, under the pretext of restoring his health, which had suffered from his wound, and the harassing measures taken against him by the Secretaries of State, Lord Egremont and Lord Halifax, and no sooner was he out of the kingdom than the ministers proceeded to outlawry, dismissed him from his command as Colonel of the Buckinghamshire Militia, and expelled him from his seat in Parliament. While in Paris, he was challenged to fight by Captain Forbes, on account of the reflections which he had cast upon the birthplace of the gallant captain, Scotland, but he declined the invitation, alleging that he had still an affair to settle with Lord Egremont before he could venture to take any other duel upon his hands. The death of that noble lord, however, left him free to fight, but on his writing to accept the challenge, his antagonist was not to be found. Mr. Wilkes subsequently returned to London, and gave notice that he should appear to answer the charges preferred against him on a certain day, and then, having appeared in his place as an alderman in Guildhall, on his return the mob took the horses from his carriage and dragged it to his house, crying, "Wilkes and liberty!" On the 21st of February 1764, the trial of Mr. Wilkes, upon the accusations alleged against him, came on before Lord Mansfield, and he was found guilty on both charges. subject to arguments upon certain points as to the validity of his apprehension, the seizure of his papers, and the judgment of outlawry which had been obtained against him. The discussions preliminary to these arguments occupied the courts at various times during a space of 2 years, and in the meantime the popularity of Mr. Wilkes and the outrages of the mob increased daily. At length, on the 27th of April 1768, Mr. Wilkes, having been served with a writ of capias legatum, was brought to the floor of the Court of King's Bench in the custody of the proper officer, in order that the question of his being admitted to bail might be considered. A long argument took place, but it terminated in favour of the Crown, and Mr. Wilkes was conveyed to the King's Bench prison. On his way thither, the mob seized the coach in which he was carried, and taking the horses from it, dragged him to a public house in Spitalfields, where they permitted him to alight, but at about 11 o'clock at night he effected his escape from his overzealous friends, and, proceeding to the prison, immediately surrendered himself unto the lawful custody. On the following day he was visited by many of his friends, and a vast mob having collected outside the prison, it was feared that some outrage would be committed. All remained quiet, however, until night, when the rails by which the prison wall was surrounded were pulled up and burned as a bonfire, and the inhabitants of Southwark were compelled to illuminate their houses. But upon the arrival of a captain's guard of soldiers, the crowd dispersed without doing any further mischief. On the 28th of April the case of outlawry was determined, and Mr. Serjeant Glynn having appeared on the part of Mr. Wilkes, and the Attorney General for the Crown, a learned and lengthy argument was heard, the result of which was a unanimous expression on the part of the court that the outlawry must be reversed. The general warrant on which the accused had been apprehended was next considered and declared illegal, but the counsel for the Crown then immediately moved that judgment might be passed upon Mr. Wilkes upon the several convictions which had taken place. This was answered by a motion on his part in arrest of judgment, and the following Thursday was fixed upon for the hearing the point argued. In the meantime a mob had remained assembled around the prison, whom no efforts of the civil force could disperse, but at length the justices appeared, followed by a troop of soldiers, determined at once to put an end to the alarming nuisance which had so long existed. All attempts to procure the separation of the crowd by fair means having failed, the Riot Act was read, and this also having no effect, the soldiers were ordered to fire. The command was instantly obeyed, and many persons were killed and dangerously wounded, some of whom were passing at a distance from the scene of confusion. At length the day arrived on which the last effort was to be made to get rid of the charges against Mr. Wilkes, but the arguments for an arrest of judgment, though carried on with great ingenuity, would not hold, and he was found to have been legally convicted of writing the libels. For that, in the North Briton, he was fined £500 and sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment in the King's Bench prison, and for the Essay on a Woman, £500 more, a further imprisonment of 12 months, and to fine security for his good behaviour for 7 years. Previously to his imprisonment, Mr. Wilkes had been elected Member of Parliament for Middlesex, when the address which he published to his constituents contained the following passages: "In the whole progress of ministerial vengeance against me for several years, I have shown, to the conviction of all mankind, that my enemies have trampled on the laws, and have been actuated by the spirit of tyranny and arbitrary power. The general warrant under which I was first apprehended has been judged illegal. The seizure of my papers was condemned judicially. The outlawry, so long the topic of violent abuse, is at last declared to have been contrary to law, and on the ground first taken by my friend Mr. Serjeant Glynn, is formally reversed." The mob, after the election, proceeded to the commission of the most violent outrages. They broke the windows of Lord Bute, the Prime Minister, and of the Mansion House, including even those of the Lady Mayoress's bedchamber, and forced the inhabitants of the metropolis to illuminate their houses, crying out "Wilkes and Liberty," and all who refused to echo it back were knocked down. A stone was thrown by this daring mob at the Polish Count Rowotzki, which he dexterously caught in his hand, the windows of his carriage in which he sat being fortunately down, and his lordship looking out and smiling, he received no other violence. The outrages of the populace were too many to be enumerated. Several innocent people were killed, and vast numbers wounded. They broke windows without number, destroyed furniture, and even insulted royalty itself. These disgraceful tumults were not confined to the metropolis, and the lenity, or, as some did not hesitate to assert, the timidity of the government spread disaffection into all classes of mechanics, who, thinking the time at hand when they might exact what wages they pleased, perhaps even beyond their masters' profits, struck work. The sailors, following the example of the landsmen, went in a body of many thousands, with drums beating and colours flying, to St. James's Palace, and presented a petition to the king praying a relief of grievances. 2 days afterwards they assembled in much greater numbers and proceeded as far as Palace Yard, in order to petition Parliament for an increase of wages, when they were addressed by 2 gentlemen standing on the top of a hackney coach, who told them that their petition could not be immediately attended to, but that it would be considered and answered in due time, whereupon the tars gave 3 cheers, and for a while dispersed. A short time afterwards, however, they reassembled at Limehouse, and boarding several outward bound vessels, seized their crews, pretending that they would not suffer any ships to sail until their wages were increased. The watermen, the Spitalfields weavers, the sawyers, the hatters, and the labouring classes in the country, all combined in the attempt to procure their wages to be raised. But while in London the confusion was nearly universal, in the country its effects were confined to a few districts, where some interested persons managed to excite the peaceably disposed people to acts of outrage. They soon discovered the error into which they had fallen, however, and a few of them having suffered execution, and others some severe imprisonments, they returned to their duty. The folly of popular commotion was never better exemplified than in the case of Wilkes, whose patriotism was accidental and mercenary, for his letters to his daughter clearly show the contempt with which he regarded the enthusiasm in his favour, and the object he had in view in exciting hatred against the government. Many of the deluded people who shouted Wilkes and liberty were severely injured in the riots, and others were subsequently punished by the outraged laws of the country. In a short time the commotion subsided, and the author of them sunk into comparative obscurity, in which he continued until his death in 1797, at the age of 70 years. Mungo Campbell, convicted of the murder of the Earl of Eglinton. This melancholy case arose out of the existing system of game laws. The lamented Mr. Campbell was descended from a noble family of Argyll, and was born at Ayr in Scotland. His father was an eminent merchant. He had been mayor of the town, and a justice of the peace, but having no less than 24 children, and meeting with many losses in his commercial transactions, it was impossible for him to make any adequate provision for his family, so that on his death the relations took care of the children, and educated them in the liberal manner which is customary in Scotland. The unhappy subject of this narrative was protected by an uncle, who gave him a learned education, but this generous friend, dying when the youth was about 18 years of age, left him £60 a year, and earnestly recommended him to the care of his other relations. The young man was a finished scholar, but seemed averse to make choice of any of the learned professions. His attachment appeared to be the military life, in which many of his ancestors had distinguished themselves. He soon followed the bent of his inclinations, and entered as a cadet in the Royal Regiment of Scots Greys, then commanded by his relation General Campbell, and served during 2 campaigns at his own expense. Being disappointed in obtaining promotion, however, he returned to Scotland in the year 1745, and Lord Loudon, to whom he was distantly related, having the command of the loyal Highlanders, who exhibited so much bravery in their opposition to the rebellion, Mr. Campbell joined that regiment, and his exertions were equally creditable to his loyalty and his courage. After the Battle of Culloden he was appointed, through the instrumentality of Lord Loudon, to fill the situation of an officer of excise in Ayrshire, and notwithstanding the unpleasant nature of his employment, he succeeded by his courtesy in obtaining the good will of all his neighbours, all of whom, with the exception of the Earl of Eglinton, gave him permission to kill game on their estates. It was his misfortune to live immediately adjoining the property of his lordship, and it would appear that the noble Earl, having once detected him in killing a hare, warned him not to commit a similar offence again. Mr. Campbell apologised for the trespass of which he had been guilty, and excused himself by stating that he was in search of smugglers, and that having suddenly started the hare he was surprised, and without thinking he shot it. The ill will which was raised in his lordship's mind by this circumstance was in no wise removed by some proceedings which Mr. Campbell was compelled to take against Bartley Moore, one of his servants, for smuggling, and it appears that his lordship's death was eventually attributable to the steps which he took at the instigation of this very person. About 10 in the morning of the 24th of October 1769, Campbell took his gun and went out with another officer with a view to detect smugglers. Mr. Campbell took with him a licence for shooting which had been given him by Dr. Hunter, though they had no particular design of killing any game, but he intended to shoot a woodcock if they should see one. They crossed a small part of Lord Eglinton's estate in order to reach the seashore, where they intended to walk, but when they arrived at this spot it was near noon, and Lord Eglinton came up in his coach, attended by Mr. Wilson, the carpenter, who was working for him, and followed by 4 servants on horseback. On approaching the coast, his lordship met Bartley Moore, who told him that there were some poachers at a distance. Mr. Wilson would have endeavoured to draw off his lordship's notice from such business, but Bartley Moore saying that Campbell was among the poachers, Lord Eglinton quitted his coach and mounted a led horse, rode to the spot where he saw Campbell and the other officer, whose name was Brown. His lordship said, "Mr. Campbell, I did not expect to have found you so soon again on my grounds, after your promise when you shot the hare. I must desire that you will give me your gun." Mr. Campbell refused to deliver up his property, because he said that he was not employing it in an unlawful manner, on which Lord Eglinton rode towards him, apparently with the intention of taking it from him. Mr. Campbell on this raised his gun, and retreating, presented it at his lordship's body, but the latter still followed him, and smiling asked him if he meant to shoot him. He said that he would if he did not keep off, and then Lord Eglinton desired that his gun should be brought up to him from the carriage. In the interim his lordship dismounted, and going close to Mr. Campbell, again required that he should deliver up the weapon which he carried, but the latter declared that he had a right to carry it, and that he would deliver it to no man, and repeated that his lordship must therefore keep off, unless he wished to be shot. Bartley Moore now interfered, and Mr. Campbell, stumbling against a stone, fell, and Lord Eglinton then advanced as if to seize him. In a moment, however, Mr. Campbell raised himself on his elbow and lodged the contents of his piece in the noble Earl's left breast. His lordship directly cried out that he was killed, and Mr. Campbell was seized, but his lordship desired that no violence should be used towards him. Lord Eglinton's seat was about 3 miles from the place where this fatal event happened, and his servants put him into the carriage to convey him home. In the meantime Campbell's hands were tied behind him, and he was conducted to the town of Saltcoats, the place of his former station as an exciseman. His lordship, after languishing for 10 hours, died, and Mr. Campbell was then committed to the jail of Ayr to await his trial. Upon his being arraigned upon the indictment preferred against him, various arguments were urged in his favour. It was said that the gun went off by accident, and therefore it could be no more than casual homicide. Secondly, that supposing it had been fired with an intention to kill, yet the act was altogether justifiable, because of the violent provocation he had received, and he was doing no more than defending his life and property. Thirdly, it could not be murder, because it could not be supposed that Mr. Campbell had any malice against his lordship, and the action itself was too sudden to admit of deliberation. The counsel for the prosecution urged in answer, in the first place, that it was certain malice was implied, in consequence of Campbell's presenting the gun to his lordship, and telling him that, unless he kept off, he would shoot him. Secondly, that there was no provocation given by the Earl besides the words, and words could not be construed a provocation in law. Thirdly, the Earl had a right to seize his gun, in virtue of several Acts of Parliament, which were the established laws of the land to which every subject is obliged to be obedient. After repeated debates between the lawyers of Scotland, a day was at length appointed for the trial, which commenced on the 27th of February 1770, before the High Court of Justiciary, and the jury having found Mr. Campbell guilty, he was sentenced to die. The Lord Justice Clerk, before he pronounced the solemn sentence, addressed himself to the convict, advising him to make the most devout preparation for death, as all hopes of pardon would be precluded from the nature of his offence. The prisoner conducted himself throughout the whole proceedings with utmost calmness, and took leave of his friends in the evening with great apparent cheerfulness, and retiring to his apartment he begged the favour of a visit from them on the following day. In the morning of the 28th of February 1770, however, he was found dead, hanging to the end of a form which he had set upright, and a silk handkerchief fastened around his neck. The following lines were found upon the floor close to the body: "Farewell, vain world, I've had enough of thee, and now am careless what thou sayest of me. Thy smiles I court not, nor thy frowns I fear, my cares are past, my heart lies easy here. What faults they find in me take care to shun, and look at home, enough is to be done." End of Part 30.